Okay. Jeff asked me, we were talking about like certifying carbon benefit for wood products, pathway number 8. Like, how would you really do this in reality? And I was saying that that's going to be really tricky, really challenging, especially from the perspective of landscape scale carbon storage. Like, how do we certify that a wood product is having a positive effect on that, right? And it's going to require us to have other systems in place. And Jeff and I were having some discussion of that. And Jeff asked if we, don't already have that, or if people aren't already working towards that. And my response, Jeff, what I know is that I think we're still some ways away from that. Um, in North America, certainly we have the kind of baseline accounting that market systems are now employing that give us some sense of what's happening with carbon storage on the landscape. So that's one thing we can look at. And then we also have now the 5 or 7 year assessments that the U.S. Forest Service is doing using FIA data in the U.S. The Canadian Forest Service has their own version of that. So, that'll give us some sense of what's happening kind of regionally with storage, but we also are going to need that information at the sort of property level as well. And we don't, individual landowners might have that, but we don't really have like a consistent or standardized certification system in place for that.
I see Peter Moonen put his hand up, and Peter and I had a fantastic conversation the other day. Peter, I'd love to hear what you have to say about that.
One of the things that is going to be problematic in determining the carbon impact of wood is that it can't be applied generically across all species from all sources. And yet that's what architects, that's what cities want. They don't want to be saying, well, I want 6% of my wood to come from that particular sawmill because they have self-generated electricity. So I think the other thing around LCA and carbon evaluation is so much of the LCA is based on assumptions, which are variable based on what we as humans want to do. How much of the wood, say biogenic carbon, for example, how much of the wood goes to landfill? GWP Bio is going to have a different rate than Athena, then it's going to have a different rate than Tally. Those are attempts to determine the impact on the environment, but the assumptions vary widely. And I think as any of you have tried LCA, there are different tools that will give you different results. And the variance is not based on the LCI data, but it's based on our assumptions of what's going to happen now, where it comes from, and where it's going. And those are things that we have to wrestle with. So we're never going to get the exact amount. I always say the one thing I'm definitely sure of is that I'm wrong. It's just how big is the margin of error. So while the intent would be great to have a carbon benefit, there's going to be a lot of variability, and that leads to uncertainty in the value proposition of it, for what it's worth.
How do we bridge that uncertainty with the I guess you could say the belief that we need to move forward? I think this is one of the things that stalls us, is that the uncertainty makes it easier to stay with the status quo. I think to Nicole's point earlier, it was, some people would push back, Nicole, on what you were saying, to say, like, wait, don't move forward until you know that you've got it right. And that's a perfectly legitimate thing to say as well. Another is that to get the systems changed, you have to be kind of developing and innovating even without knowing all the answers. So I don't know if probably lots of people could speak to that. Anyone want to jump in on that? Nicole, briefly, and then let's also hear from others. Yeah, please.
Sorry, just really briefly, but we did extensive LCA with Tally, and I was saying in my first breakout session that Tally is so conservative. It assumes, I forget what it is, like 65% of the mass timber is just going to get thrown in the landfill. Which in a way is good because it's very conservative in the carbon numbers, which are still better. But I see that as a policy opportunity. And as we're, trying to put this into practice, which I think is the way forward, there's an opportunity for like Nordic labels every single component that's in a building. Maybe there's a way that a developer the building owner holds the information about the building and what the components are, so that would make it easier to have sort of a secondary market for materials if and when the building is deconstructed.
Great, thanks. Does anyone else want to weigh in on that? We only have about 10 minutes left, so less than that, 7 minutes left. And I'm definitely going to call everyone to kind of attention for the last few minutes for our final
Let's go to
ask.
Dan, Scott.
Please, Dan.
Yeah, I'm just going to throw a grenade in this last few minutes. It's not often said in forums to do with wood, but I am not sure it's sensible to count biogenic carbon in buildings in timber, because it's already been sequestered, it's already in the trees, and quite likely someone has already counted it. So what we should be counting instead with buildings is the lock-in, and thinking forward probably more than we're thinking back. I mean, forward into the future life of the building and what happens next to the wood. I think that should be the focus, to do with actually, now we've got this carbon stuck in the wood, how long can we keep it stuck in the wood? And not thinking back to the forest at all, because that's already happened.
Personally, I couldn't agree more. Very often trees are part of national carbon accounting systems, so the carbon has been counted already. So that's an issue of double counting, and that's a problem. Second problem I see in EPDs, having negative numbers in A1 attracts very easily criticisms from the concrete industry and the steel industry. It's also quite impossible if you think about what A1 actually is. It's about incurring carbon energy logging and stuff like that. How can it be negative? Clearly the negativity comes from taking credit for something that the tree has done. And as I was saying in the previous breakout room, there is sufficient evidence for timber to win hands down without getting into the carbon sequestration. So why doing it? It's detrimental rather than supporting a quicker uptake of timber, I personally think.
Yeah, and I think it creates strange thinking, with people thinking that they're doing good things by using more timber than they need in their buildings.
What do you mean by more timber?
I was judging some competition, and the question was, how does using timber in your building help the environment? And every single project put, we've used loads of timber, and it's all sequestered CO2.
No, that's a good point. But if you're not using the timber, you're using something else.
But is it not better to build 3 buildings out of wood than build 1 building out of the same amount of wood? That's what I'm saying.
Well, Dan, I think it's an economic question. While Jeff's point is a jump off point, I'll speak specifically to the structure. You're not going to get a developer, a client, an architect, an engineer, or a GC to warrant you putting more wood in the structure than what is required.
Have you seen CLT?
Structural? I'm talking structurally. Structurally, The requirements are there. And yes, I've seen CLT. Yeah, absolutely. I design with it every day.
Yeah,
right?
well, we're building
it's not lean construction per se, but it's a proper application and a proper use. I'd much rather see a 7-inch thick CLT floor than have a 6-inch of concrete on steel pan.
But we're building 1- and 2-story houses out of CLT that could be like timber frame.
I'm not saying that's a good use. That gets back to the definition of sustainability. And one of the points that we had in a prior breakout was the fact that, to me, you cannot consider a project sustainable if the use of the wood is in the structure is less than the life cycle or the growth cycle of the tree itself. So if you're going to have a product that takes 80 to 100 years to grow, and you're building single family homes that have a 50-year value, that's not sustainable unless we go back to having a breakdown methodology like Nicole was driving at, where you've got an inventory of what that element is and where it's going to be reused, right? So that all needs to be part of the discussion. And while I'd love to see biogenic carbon not be part of the cost of a structure, the reality is if we don't do it, the concrete and steel industry are getting as green as they can. and they're driving the dialogue right now. We have to turn that back to our side of the table, right? So it's frustrating to see large people, large timber companies that are pushing for agendas that are not necessarily sustainable, but they're viewed as green. So I'm with you on that point, absolutely. But we have to get the dialogue to a certain starting point before we can jump off and say, okay, well, this is negated now. Policy is driven in the US by industry, and it's adopted by government, which is completely different than everywhere else in the world, right? Government builds the code and industry adopts. And in the US, it's different. So you have a completely divergent approach to how people are viewing things, and you have people that are out protecting their own agendas, driving the law through their lobbying efforts. So it's a slippery slope, especially when you're considering the amount of construction that has to happen in each of those nations, right?
I think
It's
part
just
of
quick, Peter. Can I just before you
Sure.
speak, because we're at 2:00, and I don't want to lose anyone before making this message to putting this message out to all, and then we'll stay on for longer, and I hope many of you will stick with us for a bit. Part of the purpose of bringing you all together was to engage you in this process and build that relationship and have you bring your inputs into this process, help us shape this work that we're doing. We realize we can't do it without you. And so I just want to just appeal to everyone that's here to have a look at the document that you may have worked on, put some more comments in there. There's 3 ways to provide feedback to us. One is to use that worksheet that was given. If you want to go back to it, it's still accessible. You're going to get a survey, a link to a survey. Any comments, thoughts, however technical or general, please put them in that survey. And then the third, and this might be the most important for us, is please review the PDF that has the pathways in it and use the comments feature. It's a shared PDF. So just like in any other, you can just click on a sentence and you can make a comment in that PDF. Like, hey, you're missing an important part of this idea of strategic geography, and write your blurb in there. So just hit us with anything you can so that we can just keep sharpening this process. I just want to thank you in advance for people dropping off, and I'm going to stay around for a while, and I hope some of you do too.
Well, and I also thank everyone for sticking around for all the time that they've given today and all the feedback. I mean, it's just really, really great to do this and to see you all, and hopefully next year we'll be able to do this in person.
Yeah.
But yeah, I believe.
Thank you, Scott.
Thanks, Jeff. Thank you. And look, Peter, I cut you off. I'd love you to restart the conversation. And I know some people will have to drop off, but there's probably quite a number of us that would love to stay on and keep talking about this.
Yeah, no worries. When Dan said, using too much timber, I interpreted that in the context of displacing lumber frame or light frame buildings with a CLT building. To Mark's point, or Jean-Marc's point, building a house or a building that can be well built with light frame uses a lot more wood. Sure, you sequester more, but you have a lot more embodied impact. And I think to Dan's point, if you have a certain amount of wood and you're capable of building 3 buildings with that same amount of wood, it's better from an environmental point of view. It's when because we're looking at the displacement of the emissions associated with the construction. When you're displacing concrete or steel in a building that can't be built with light frame, then you're getting a benefit. But in British Columbia, our typical houses are made with lumber and panels. It makes no carbon sense to build it with CLT, because you can get a very high performing, high quality, strong earthquake proof building using about 1/5 or 1/6 of the wood, with using the light frame system. So I think it's a matter of what are we displacing with CLT? Are we displacing steel and concrete, or are we displacing a lighter frame, lower impact, equally performing wood building? Dan, that's how I interpreted the question. Maybe I interpreted it incorrectly.
Others.
You got what I was saying.
I think that reinforces the idea to take A1, the negative values out of A1 in a way. Because if we are aiming to build net zero carbon buildings, whatever this means, and I'm not even sure it's possible, but there's no input for optimization or resource efficiency, because if you're using more wood, or if you're using an inefficient wood solution with more wood mass in it, you get a higher negative multiplier, and therefore you drive down your overall whole life carbon.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what if, to throw a bit of a wrench in there, if using wood 2x4 stud framing versus mass timber changes the longevity of that wood in use? In other words, the typical scenario for a light wood frame house is that it's demoed after 60, 70 years and that wood is landfilled. Is the profile of the wood attached sufficiently that using mass timber, even though it's less efficient, actually produces, your 200-year scenario of use versus your 60 scenario,
Well, I would argue that that's an issue that's relative to design and our ability to deconstruct, as the chat says. Most of the buildings that we tear down today are not torn down because they are incapable of performing. They're torn down because someone says, "Oh, my land value went up. Oh, I don't like that building. Oh, I needed more space." So those are human decisions that we're making. It's not because the building is inherently bad or decrepit. It's that we want to do something else. That's not going to change whether it's CLT or light frame or concrete or steel. But are we designing it so that we can take it apart, reuse it, and as we said, not just recover it for biomass, but reuse it as a system. And so that the whole intent of designing for deconstruction extends that longevity beyond what the building may have been designed for, because we're saying, okay, we're taking it apart, we're going to reuse it. And that's a human decision. It's not a material decision. That's up to us. Materials don't fail people. People fail materials. And if we don't design it well so that it can survive, then that's our fault. It's not on the fault of the material.
I agree completely, Peter. And I think we even need to go one step before we can do this design for deconstruction. We have to do design for not effing things up. Because we use so many adhesives in modern constructions and gluing all these materials together that we're totally messing up this shearing layer thing that was in the How Buildings Learn book. And it's a real problem for people who are dismantling buildings and trying to recover the materials, even into low-grade uses.
Yeah.
At the risk of offending someone, several years ago, I was at a building materials reuse conference, and I was chatting, and I said, well, so we really need to do less gluing and more screwing. And I hadn't realized what I'd said, so I'm sorry if I offend anybody here, but that was the thing, because glues and nails are impossible to recover. So I did blush when I said that. So that was a dozen years ago. But I think it's true. We need to be able to dismantle these buildings and reuse as is, not degrade for another use.
That's known as a humble brag when you say you blushed years ago, but you still bring the story up.
Yeah.
Peter. So
but Jean-Marc, you know me, that I don't blush easily.
Exactly. Well, I mean, there are worse applications, and one of the things I don't want to beat a dead horse, but Dan, we're talking about proper utilization of material. One thing that I find exceedingly frustrating is when the forest products industry embraces manufacturers of CLT whose sole purpose is for rig mats. I don't know if you're familiar with rig mats in the UK, but basically it's drilling equipment, and typically for the petrochemical industry. The two largest CLT manufacturers in North America right now by volume, that's their sole purpose. And to me, it's an absolute crime against nature to be building CLT panels to be used as rig mats to exacerbate our reliance on fossil fuels.
And it's disposable.
Yep, totally disposable. I mean, I don't know that there's a 5-year lifespan with that.
Yeah.
Wow. Does anyone? This is amazing. So I'm looking at my screen to see if there's any hands raised.
Yeah, I just have a kind of a nuance right now about this same theme about it. You end up using more wood, and I just want to kind of the report from the front lines when you're really competing against concrete and steel in the hearts and minds of architects is tricky, because they actually now they do believe that wood's the right thing to do, and yet they use more than they mean to, because they don't know how to optimize, and then they actually can't compete on cost. And so how many times does somebody fail at that, or get to be the one who always gets sort of brushed aside, like you always want to use wood, but the cost is always higher? And how many times before this industry realizes that cost competitiveness and overcoming our perception of not having it is really a critical adoption thing, and we have to optimize so we can compete. It's not really a question of so that it fits in with this, we're using more than we should, but it also fits in with sometimes we're using more than we mean to, so we can't even get the wood onto the job, and the people who fall back to status quo really reinforce their whole argument about why wood is not ready for prime time. So I think that anybody who can help solve that, any education, any tools, any practice leaders who are doing that well, needs kind of reinforcement, because that's the frontline issue right now.
Mm-hmm.
And that comes from architects and engineers and contractors not knowing how to use it. And that's where the education needs to be. I mean, if you can have a really good architect who's fabulous at designing things, but if they've never used wood, or if an engineer has never used wood, there's an element of caution and a bit of overuse. So we need to teach our architects and our engineers and our contractors in university, not just postgraduate where they're 15 years and they've established their routine. They have to be taught in the university when they're learning the skills. Like an architect, and I said this to Scott earlier, an architect is like a chef. They got to understand chefs understand the 4 basic food groups. Architects and engineers and contractors have to understand the 4 basic structural material groups: stone and masonry, concrete, steel, and wood. Be like, if you didn't understand wood, it's like a chef not understanding vegetables. So you really you don't have to use it only, but you just have to understand how to integrate it, to optimize its use, to reduce the impact, reduce the cost, and still have a high performing building. But we don't teach that. Yeah. I don't know if there's any architects here. How many of you studied wood for more than 8 hours in 4 years?
I can chime in as a structural engineer. I did have an entire wood design class, which was very helpful, which I use almost every day. But what was absent from that was any sort of element as to how the wood was sourced, whether or not the forest was certified, nothing to do with the supply chain, just when you have a wood problem to solve from a technical aspect, this how many bolts or this how many dowels you need to do it. And I think what is lacking is the philosophical underpinnings behind what sustainability actually means. And that is completely devoid from engineering curriculum in wood design and in many different aspects. And that is certainly something that is really unfortunate, and that needs to change.
There are some positive news on that. SOM has been leading on a climate framework, and they'll be advocating for integrating this into university curricula. I reviewed it for them. It's going to be announced before Christmas. So there's going to be a big industry movement, because the industry has realized they can't find the graduates they need. So the best way to do this is, to ask academia to start producing them anyway.
And Francesco, to that point, I mean, we know that these frameworks are in different stages of development, sort of out there. If you're a reviewer of that one, it's obviously not public yet, but we'd love to see it at whatever point and see what we're doing here, what we proposed. Is it exactly the same thing, or is it different?
No, it's very different. I think that that's far more generalistic in scope, in the sense that it's a preliminary document that aims at starting the conversation as to what should be taught in curriculum that aims to be relevant to the current challenges. So it's broader in scope. I need to go. I've got a small child to go back to. But one thing that I want to say with the embodied carbon hat on, and it's something that I didn't hear today, is I think we should question a bit more whether we need to build at all in the first place. So we need to make sure that we build after we've answered the question that we need to build. I was looking at something that I found really shocking, and I've only discovered it a couple of days ago. The number of dwellings in England every year exceeds the number of new households. So there isn't a availability crisis in terms of housing. There is an affordability crisis. And the two things are very different, because if you listen to the UK government, it seems that the solution is building more houses. But the numbers tell that we've got already enough floor area to accommodate everyone. So the problem is with the affordability of that floor area. Within the current economic paradigm, if we keep doing things like we always did, the new houses will be bought by wealthy people who will rent them out, and it's not going to, it's not building more houses that will solve the problem. We need to address the affordability side of the things, not the availability one. And sorry for throwing those in at the very end.
No, but that's
really
important because construction prices in America have gone up 8, almost 9 times in 50 years, and it far outpaces inflation, and simultaneously productivity goes down. We get less mileage out of 1,000 feet per person put in place, and we pay more for it, both in materials and in labor. And that equation is suicide, and prefabrication is a solution, and mass timber is a way to build faster and more durably and more healthily. And I take Dan's point, which I had not heard before, and this has been so helpful, but we have to, I agree with you, we have to solve the cost issue. It's because there are millions and millions of people going homeless throughout the world. I mean, let alone we have too many expensive houses, but if we keep building them at the same cost as we have, this ever-expanding world is going to have more and more people on the street.
Thanks, Jeff.
Nice seeing you, everyone. I really must go. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much,
I hope to stay in
Francesco.
touch.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
We'll share everyone's email address.
That'd be lovely. Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.
Peter, you've been raising your hand there.
Yes, so I've got a question to everybody working in the carbon space in the boreal forest and the northern forest, coming from the tropics. So we work in the space of avoided deforestation. We're a REDD+ project under the Ecuadorian government, under the Paris Climate Accord. And so our objective is to stop deforestation, which has huge emissions. And to the degree which we accomplish that end, we're struggling with how we bring that value into the marketplace. It's not biogenic. It's not about the wood in this case. It's about what the forest is not doing under deforestation, but we're maintaining all that carbon in the forest. So we're in the process of getting carbon certified for the forest, which discounts the emission, the value of the carbon dramatically. Maybe there's 300 tons per hectare in the forest on average, and if we get out 50 tons per hectare that we can claim through that whole certification process, we'll be lucky. But how, from your framework, how would we bring that into the marketplace as an attribute, as a benefit of the product? It's not like it's very distinct from what you're talking about in terms of either displacing concrete and steel or just it's about not emitting a whole bunch of carbon, which is essential to do to keep the forest there.
Are you saying, Peter, how do you make that explicit as part of the value that someone's willing to pay for? Is that what your question is?
Not to pay for, just to accept it that is a benefit at the receiving end to participate in a transaction which saves X number of hectares of forest.
But you want people to buy the product that is offering that, right? As opposed and instead of something that isn't, right? So you'd like someone to buy a countertop that's made of wood that's protecting the forest, as opposed to, say, a granite countertop, because they see that benefit and somehow have a way of realizing that benefit.
Yes, and we're going to end up with a number. Yeah. The number is the area of forest that sourced that countertop, and the probability that is no longer going to go into in the atmosphere from deforestation. And so there's a real value that gets certified. We're pulling our hair out trying to figure out how do we take that attribute and bring it into the marketplace, not to sell it. It's more like FSC certification. You don't get a higher price because of FSC certification. The person who gets that has a little bit of risk taken out from them about what you're doing in the forest. So this is a question for people who have been in the carbon space for a lot longer than we have. Does this seem like a phony attribute, or does this seem like a real thing, and how should we be treating it?
It's such a good question. There's no way I'm going to answer it on a calculated basis, but it's definitely real. I know the tropics well enough to know that, and I'm not aware of a metric yet that does what you are asking, but I'd love to know from people who do.
Well, the carbon certification that is what they do all day long, and they discount it by additionality, they discount it by the permanence of your operation, they discount it by leakage. People that don't deforest in the piece of land you're talking about go off and do it somewhere else. All those kind of things get integrated. That's why they discount it so much. But you end up with a number which is, as we've heard many times, based on a whole bunch of assumptions, which are undoubtedly not what actually, they're assumptions, and assumptions are just that.
Peter, if we were to compare this to buying a carton of milk right now, if I walk into a grocery store and I see 10 different options for a liter of milk, how do I make a decision, and what do I even want? Do I care that there's no steroids and hormones used in the cows? Do I care? So we all kind of know this story, right? Everyone on this call could rhyme off 10 different features of milk production that we may care about or not care about. Free range, grass-fed cows, or maybe it's just buy your milk from Quebec. Here we are in Quebec. So I've got these very simple and accessible filters for how I'm going to choose my milk. And it can be regional. I can just say, well, I know Quebec is pretty good. If I buy milk from Quebec, it's not going to have, it's illegal to have hormones. And so just do that. So that's not certified. It's just, all I do is say made in Quebec. Or I can buy Nutrell, filtered, free, whatever. So here are certified, uncertified, regional, all those things. The consumer has to care about it, for one thing, right? So if I don't care, then obviously I'm just going to buy the milk that's the cheapest. So knowing what to ask for, knowing why it might be of value to me and of use to me, and then knowing how different ways of acquiring that, and believing that, because every one of those 10 milk choices has a different price, right? It starts at 99 cents and it goes up to $2.99 or $3.99, and people are buying all of them. Otherwise there wouldn't be. If there is a market for the $3.99 milk, it may not be a very big one. So I don't know if that's helpful to think about. To answer your question, is like the way that the consumer sees, wants, and realizes the value is.
So that's a story. that's good storytelling, and that is certainly part of it. We're talking to the ILFI about their requirement to offset carbon, the embodied carbon in buildings, and about whether they'd be interested in taking that on as one of the ways that they would accept that would be offsetting the carbon, because it is a carbon offset. But we're not trying to sell carbon. We're trying to sell wood products. But we would like to deliver that benefit of participating, as you say, if you're participating in helping to save forest and prevent all those emissions. But okay, so I guess it is far enough different than the way we're talking about carbon here about in mass timber that it's hard to put those two pieces together. And that's just something we're struggling with. So anybody who'd like to talk about that any further, I would love to continue that conversation.
Yeah, Peter, I'm just going to jump in and say that we're asking the same questions at Trilox, very interested in that as sort of a piece of the puzzle of understanding how a product is impacting, its original source. Yeah, we're asking the same questions.
Peter Moonen just put in a good comment in the chat in case you're not looking at the chat,
Okay.
which I think is partly what I was trying to get at is people have to care. They have to want to know what's in it for them, as Peter's words in there. So knowing what to ask for before you actually know how to validate, right? Peter Pinchot, my point about the milk wasn't that it's just a story. It's that I'm looking for ways to validate that I'm going to get what I'm paying for. So first I have to want it. And then I can either just trust that the Quebec government is doing everything for me and that's fine and they're doing a good job, or I can say I'm only going to buy it if it's certified organic. And I trust that the certification process is strong enough to carry that value to me. I trust that. So there's still a bit of trust, but it's not simply telling a story. Another is that I buy from a local farmer who tells me a story about, inheriting the land from his grandfather and such, and they only have 25 cows. And that's another way of getting the product. And that's more of a relationship and narrative-based approach, all of which would apply to wood in terms of how do we see through the supply chain to the end and see what the benefits are. How accurate is that vision? How much validation do we need through external bodies like certification or national governments or jurisdictions? That's the strategic geography piece of our approach. Anyway, I'll
Yep. Thanks.
Aaron, you haven't said much, but Aaron Vaden-Yeomans, as an architect. Oh, sorry, there's people with their hands up, and I did not see that. So let's go to the people with their hands up before the ones that haven't had their hands up.
Scott looks at real hands, not Zoom hands.
Okay, so who's got their hand up?
Dan and Lars.
Okay, well, we haven't heard from Lars yet. Can we hear from Lars?
Certainly. On the milk cartons, just crosses my mind that from January 1st, 2022, Sweden will require that all new buildings have a climate declaration. And that is a way of helping you select among those different types of milk, right? Whether you want to or not, but the information will be out there. It's mandatory, but I wanted to raise something else. I listened to you all, and I understand that you know a lot about buildings and architecture and things like that, and you know many details, and I don't. So I have a different perspective, and I wanted to throw something out to you as I can see it in a very simplistic matter, and you can shoot it down. And an analogy is, this carbon capture and storage technology that the big engineers are selling with lots of money for the big emitters. But if you go with that logic, we have nothing other than the forest of vegetation, I should say, to capture carbon. And even in bioenergy and CCS, it's actually growing vegetation that captures the carbon, takes it out of the atmosphere. So forest is an excellent carbon trap, right? It's not very good for storage. It's not stable over the long term. You have fires, you have insects, you have pests, you have wind throw, whatnot. It's an excellent carbon trap. It's not good for storage. But you can sort of tap that carbon trap and put the wood into storage. And ideally, you put it into long-term storage for many decades where it also provides great benefit to people. And you want to keep it locked up in that storage as long as possible. And then you have your capture, your carbon capture, use and storage. And I hear you talk about all these details about the different buildings and all that, and it's so expensive, it's so difficult, or you want to trace it back to the individual stands, you can be sure that everything is all right. And I sort of look at it, a global picture, and said, let's grow as many trees as we can to capture this carbon, and then let's put the carbon away into long-term storage that is beneficial to people. And I don't hear you talk about that, and I ask myself, where am I wrong? Why are you not talking about this? Why is it so difficult for you? There, I'm finished.
Thanks, Lars. I mean, I think that was the hope of the panel in the morning was to get into that a lot, and we did do it. So love to hear from others. And Francesco has left us, but he was advocating on the side of don't count the biogenic carbon in the calculation. And you're going to the exact opposite, right? That is, we have to calculate it and think about it. But is the issue between those 2 points of view the idea of net carbon? In other words, it's not simply you can't just count the carbon in the wood. You have to count all of the emissions that come with that, which may not be as efficient a storage vehicle as you might think by the time you get it into the building.
So I'm not an accountant, and I don't care so much about accounting rules. I see them more as sort of imperfection as well as help, right? But we know that if you want to get carbon out of the atmosphere, the only way we can effectively do this now is by growing vegetation. The more it grows, the more captured carbon it captures. But we know that this is not stable storage. So at some point we have to empty that storage to make room for even more uptake, and transfer the carbon into another place that is more stable. And I can think of nothing better than buildings because they are very well monitored. People tend to live there. And if you design them right, the carbon can stay there for a long, long time. And at the same time, we replace other materials in many cases that would emit a lot more carbon. It's very simple. You don't need accounting rules to get this.
Dan, your hand is up, and I know you spoke to that earlier, so maybe you have some words for Lars and the rest of us.
Yeah, so I agree with a lot of what Lars said. The kind of forests that we have in our part of the world, they are not stable containers of the carbon. That should be counted when the wood goes into products. That should be counted, but I would advocate that that's counted at the forest management level rather than the wood products use level. One reason that I say that is because we're making planting decisions about what kind of things we plant. And if people aren't counting the offset benefit of wood products, we end up planting useless, from a wood products point of view, useless species, because people are emphasizing other aspects of forestry. So I think it's a very important thing, but it's probably quite unique to northern forests, this issue, because there are definitely forests that are better stable carbon sinks than any wood products.
What does that mean by unstable? By saying it is unstable storage of carbon?
if the forest dies or burns, then
Okay.
CO2
All
is released.
Okay.
Or
And,
if the forest reaches a plateau of carbon uptake, right? In other words, and that's one of the main arguments, which has been a bit debunked, but I think that does come down to a regional, like a temperate forest in the middle of the U.S. or southern Canada has a longer upward slope, right, than a boreal forest. Once it gets there in northern Canada, the calculations that we saw recently was that Canadian forests are carbon positive. In other words, there's more carbon being released from Canadian forests than is being sequestered. They're net positive because of die-off and fires and everything else. And so the argument there would be, can management play a role in tweaking that line from being carbon positive to carbon negative?
But there's another aspect on that. So sorry, and that if you use the forest for carbon storage, then you lose the human benefit. Whereas if you empty the forest and put the carbon in storage in buildings, then you get human benefit. And we know we have 1 billion or more people living in informal settlements and slums all over the world. And as long as you keep the carbon in the forest and you don't use it, these people will still suffer. And in all these equations that we saw earlier, I didn't see the factor of the cost of human suffering. That was factored to exactly 0. It didn't even show up in this modeling. And this makes you almost upset. There are good reasons to use the forest to take up carbon, but there are not good reasons to use the forest to store carbon. It's much better stored in a place where it provides human benefit. And I this is very clear in my mind, but I have been wrong before, and I could be wrong about this also. So I'm very interested in what's wrong with this reasoning.
Peter, I saw your hand up, Peter Moonen, and a couple others. So go ahead, Peter, and then you're on mute, Peter.
Yeah,
and then Jeff.
You're on mute is one of the most common phrases I've heard over the last 8 months.
Not enough, apparently.
Yeah, not enough. Who said that? I guess, the thing about the Canadian forests, a lot of that emissions is due to 2 large forest fire years in 2018. But that plays to the instability of the carbon sink, because that's unpredictable. Ironically, the very thing that we want to use to combat climate change by sequestering carbon is being threatened by it. And we have to break that cycle. British Columbia, 1.4 million hectares, 3 million acres. 1.3 in 2018, 1.3 million hectares, 2.8 million hectares in acres in 2017. 130 million metric tons of CO2 emissions, 3 times what normally is the whole province. Last year, we had 9,000 hectares of forest burn, so it was reversed. Nonetheless, that asymmetrical release of carbon that grew over anywhere from 80 to 500 years is the issue that I think Lars is dealing with. If we do remove it, and Lars, I know what you're saying when you talk about human benefit. You're referring to housing. We do get human benefit from hikes and wildlife and water and all that kind of stuff. But I think that if we just try to look at a single solution of conservation or removal, we're gonna make a well-intentioned but really naive decision. And this plays to some of the stuff that Bill was talking about earlier. Werner Kurtz at the Canadian Forest Service is working on, is that our solution is going to have to be on conservation, enhanced use of long-lived wood products, biomass where it's displacing fossil fuel and comes from residues, as well as enhanced forest management for both carbon uptake, wood quantity, and wood quality. So quite often, someone earlier said carbon sequester and reuse. I couldn't agree more. That's exactly what forests do if we're smart about it. Right now, to sequester a ton of carbon using mechanical means, not photosynthesis, is about $350 per metric ton to remove a ton of CO2. Well, if you were to take that $350 and apply it to forest management, right now, you might spend $500 a hectare to reforest, or on average. Add that $350 to a hectare. You will get a benefit over 20 to 40 years, where it's increasing 1 to 2 cubic meters per hectare per year, which is 3 to 5 metric tons of CO2 over 40 years. It's $9 a hectare. $9 a metric ton or less. So we have to look at much broader than just wood, much broader than conservation. If we put money into growing more forest land, as China is doing, growing more wood on that forest land, which is forest management, and using more wood from that now sustainable forest producing land, then you get the kind of human benefit that Lars is talking about. And to my earlier point, we have to design buildings so that they're not disposable, whether it's a rig mat from CLT or a building that we say, okay, I'm done with this. Sure, it lasted a good 20 years. That's inexcusable. So if this was an easy thing, we would have done it 40 or 50 years ago. But it's actually really challenging, really depressing, but really inspiring. And I think that's why all of us are here, because we have that, we can make a difference. That's what we have to do. Jeff, are you laughing at me or smiling at me? I don't know.
You're so right. You're so right.
Hey, Peter, to the point of looking, just quickly, Jeff, looking back in time, not very long back in time, we can see examples where people were doing exactly that because of the demands of the kind of environment and economy. In other words, you go back 100, 200 years and people weren't throwing materials away. They were reusing wood many times over. They were every stone block that was carved for a building in ancient times was probably reused, twice, 3 times, 100 times sometimes. Because why would you go to a quarry and chip another stone block out when there's one sitting there that has already been carved out? And in fact, you design your buildings around the availability of reduced energy materials because energy is expensive. And the problem, one of our greatest problems is that we have, in the last 150 years, we have created quote unquote efficiencies that are so powerful that they have basically knocked out of play all of the constraints that have traditionally forced us to reuse materials. Why on earth, if I look at a 2x4 that's come out of a demolished building, it's sitting in a dumpster and it's about to be taken to the landfill. Now, there's many parts of the world where that would never happen just because of the economy. But today you just walk by that and think, yeah, it's actually cheaper and easier for me to buy a brand new 2x4 and pay for the entire supply chain cost of bringing that 2x4 out of a forest, truck it across thousands of kilometers and put it in Home Depot and have someone barcode scan it. It's cheaper for me to do that than to take the thing out of the dumpster and pound 2 nails out of it and reuse it. It's insane how messed up our systems are right now.
And 150 years ago, labor was cheap, materials were expensive. Now it's reversed. Mm-hmm. My mom grew up, she's 92. She grew up on the prairies during the Depression. They didn't throw out anything because there was always another use. And she sort of shakes her head at all this enthusiasm over recycling because she's been doing it since she was 3. Mm-hmm. So it isn't new, but you're right. We've become accustomed to being able in our mind to think we can be wasteful. And that has to change. We have to value things differently, including how long we use it. So, sorry, Jeff, I interrupted you.
Waste of food. Now, it's too bad trees take so long to grow, because if they didn't, we would grow strong forest products, sequestering so much carbon and continue that cycle over and over again.
Lars, I've quoted your quote of one of your forestry mentors who was something like long time, big space. Yeah. So that time factor is a huge one, but maybe there's also a silver lining in that time that it forces us to think about the large landscapes of the earth and time is really a factor of space in this case, right? If you have enough area that you're dealing with, then the fact that a tree takes 50, 60, 70 years to grow is not a problem if you have enough of them growing. It's only a problem when there's not enough area to have the trees of all these different generations
And
to be able to be used.
And there's a decreasing amount of them too because of deforestation.
Yeah.
Well, deforestation really isn't a problem in properly sustainably managed forests. Deforestation is more a problem of agriculture taking over. And I think Peter Pinchot's presentation talked about that. If they remove more than 3 or 4 logs in a hectare, that means that they're going to have to put roads in instead of doing cable retrieval. And the minute they put roads in, that opens it up for guys to come in and just do agriculture. That's the problem. We don't have that problem with forests that are actually managed for lumber production. That's tropical rainforests. That that issue was prevalent with the West Coast tropical forests that we have, or temperate rainforests, the Doug firs and the big spruces, but they have a life cycle that's up to 1,500 plus years, right? So these trees that we're talking about using have a life cycle of 70 to 80 years, and they're windfalling at 100 years, 120 years. So if we're not using it, it goes back to Lars's point. We're not leaving it in the forest to decay, because then it just regenerates with zero gain. It's a net zero forest. We're net positive because we are extracting that fiber and we're putting it to use in structures. So I think that answers that part of the question, right? You're not doing that when you have large temperate rainforests that the trees, the bigger they are, the more carbon they absorb. It's the opposite with a boreal forest. The older they get, the less carbon uptake they have. So it's beholding on us to take those trees and extract them at their peak maturity and then reinstitute a vibrant young growing forest. You have to have that. I mean, that's the science behind modern forestry.
Can I add? So I will be a little bit simplistic, and I apologize for that. I know that it's more complex than what I'm going to say. But anyway, Peter showed some very interesting historical maps about how the American forest was first massacred and then sort of grew back. And we had a case in Scandinavia where I come from, where the continental Europe and the British Isles started to develop like crazy around 1850 and on, and they needed all the wood they could get. And they got it from us. So we massacred our northern forest. No more intact forest landscapes. We cut it down all in several goes and shipped all the wood down to Central Europe and the British Isles, and they built their society using this wood. And our forest has grown back. It doesn't look the same, but there's no ecological disaster area. And a lot of benefit was generated in Central Europe because of that. I think the alternative would have been worse. But I'm thinking now, I'm looking at this Agenda 2030 that all countries in the world have adopted. And they say that if we don't eradicate poverty, we'll never be able to deal with climate. Because if there is too much poverty, people will do what they have to do in order to survive, and the climate and biodiversity will suffer. So we have to eradicate poverty. And all countries in the world have basically promised to do this by 2030, which is naive. But that's basically what it says in Agenda 2030. Poverty comes first. And let's eradicate all forms of poverty by 2020, and let's leave nobody behind. And that's then broken down in all the sustainability goals, one of which is sustainable cities. And I think UN Habitat has made some calculations saying that we need to finish 100,000 new housing units per day, every day until 2030, in order to reach this particular sustainability goal. But if we build all that with steel and concrete, we'll surely break the climate budget. So we can't do that. But what if we built it with wood? The problem is that we don't want to cut down the tropical rainforest. So this wood should ideally then come from degraded lands and poorly used lands, of which there is plenty. We can put trees there, but it will take a few decades for these trees to grow. So then you start to think, okay, we need to provide housing for this billion of people living in slums, and we need to start doing it now. But we have to begin with trees that have already grown up. And that's when I think, aha, where do we have these trees? Well, we have them in the great forest in the north. We have them in Canada. We have them in Scandinavia. We have them in Russia, where for all the warts and problems, there is still a sort of more or less sustainable system of forest management. You cut down trees and you will get new trees. So let's cut down all these trees, including the carbon that these trees have captured over many decades of their life, and transfer this carbon down to the slums of Africa or developing countries to provide people a decent living so that they can begin to develop their own countries and they don't have to do other things. And let's regenerate our forest in the north. And we do it all as an act of international solidarity with poor people who suffer living in slums. So this is rather radical. And I don't want to go and propose this to any environmental organization in the north, because I know what they would do with me, and I'm not certain I'm suggesting it seriously, but it's sort of not completely not serious either, because people are suffering in slums. They need decent place to live, and we can't build this in any other way, I think, than by using trees, and we should start now. And the only trees that we have are the ones that have already grown up in a system of more or less decent forest management. That's in the global north. Let's cut down these trees and build in the global south.
It's not just in the slums that people are suffering. It's all over the world in large quantities. In the US, the richest country in the world, millions and millions of people, 8.4 million people unable to afford housing, extremely low income, or homeless. Really? Is this a humane way to run a business? Use trees.
Peter Moonen.
One of the sort of going to pull us back from the brink of being depressed here. One of the things that was talked about was the capacity of the forest. We want to build more buildings with it. One of the and that the enthusiasm over mass timber. Just a couple things to put that in perspective. We have a long way to go before we run out of wood. What will happen is that mass timber will not increase the demand for wood from well-managed countries, because most of those countries already have a limit as to what they're allowed to cut. In Quebec and British Columbia, we have an annual allowable cut, and that's it. Even if there's a demand, you're not allowed to harvest anymore. But what will happen is that low-grade wood, which can be used in the middle layers of CLT, will shift from being wood for use for concrete forms or single-use wood that is often sent out to a construction site, made into a form, and then landfilled. That will shift into higher value products. As we value the wood more, we're not going to let cheap stuff go into the landfill. We will be dragging that into a higher value, whether it's as the central cores that are non-structural in CLT, or whether it will be engineered wood for that, and it'll put pressure somewhere else, I guess, on what we use that low-grade wood for. But maybe we'll come up with something that is reusable instead of disposable. The other thing about mass timber, the anticipated global market demand for cross-laminated timber, and Jean-Marc may have a slightly different number, is between 2.5 and 3 million cubic meters by 2025. At that time, the global capacity for concrete will be 25 billion cubic meters. So 2.5 million cubic meters of CLT produced globally, which could be met by about 10% of British Columbia's 1-year harvest, or 20 to 25 billion cubic meters of concrete. Where's our big issue? You know, if globally concrete could reduce its impact by 2%, that completely obliterates any carbon benefit from using 2.5 million cubic meters of CLT. Now, I'm not saying that's what we should work for, but from a point of view of scale, one, we're not going to run out of wood if we build way more with mass timber, because we're going to shift that wood from short-term or single use into longer-term durability use. And secondly, we have a long way to go before we displace all the stuff of concrete. But the increase in wood is going to happen. It's happening in China. It's happening in the Mediterranean. It's happening in some places in the Caribbean where they're reforesting lands and increasing that capacity. So I would say that wood for cities should be paying attention to, are the forests being enhanced from this community or this group? Are you actually increasing the capacity of the forest, whether it's growing more wood on a single hectare, or whether it's growing more hectares? That's a metric that I think cities might want to pay attention to, is, are you actually increasing the ability of the forest to produce wood going down the road, or saving it from wasting it, which plays to some of the instability that Lars was talking about. Are you taking advantage of salvage wood? Are you capturing wood that is no longer growing but is still viable? These are just some things that I think we need to consider. It's because it's not an easy topic, but it's one that has lots of different options.
I'm in the mindset of sort of wrapping things up, and I see some names folks who haven't said anything. I see Nikki Gavron calling in from London, from the London Mayor's Office of the GLA. I don't know, Nikki, if you feel like saying a few words to the group. Nikki and I, over the past year and a half, have had many incredible conversations and have worked together on some projects around London for restoring some landscapes. And Nikki has a real passion for the housing issues around London and building with wood, potentially from regional forests. And so, Nikki, I don't know if you're tuned in or not right now. Perhaps she's stepped away from the video. So Trilox, Liz or Alexander, do you want to say a few words from New York City?
Sure. Hey, everybody. I just thank you all for such a informative conversation today. And thank you, Scott, for putting on such a great event. I was really really happy to hear about the focus on reuse, reclamation, reuse. It's something that at Trilox we've been focused on since the beginning, and how that also ties into emerging systems like mass timber. So I think that there are a lot of ways that material can make it into architectural projects that are maybe overlooked or thought to be limited in certain ways, either aesthetically or in terms of its engineering or grading properties, things like that, that could be rethought. Kind of switching business as usual to reconsidering application and standards. So yeah, I'm glad to see that topic being brought up. I have a lot of things to say about a lot of topics brought up, but I just want to mention that just because we do focus on that and talk about it extensively. So it's nice to see it circulating this crew here.
Alexander and the Trilocks team have a great warehouse and workshop in New York City, in Brooklyn. And when you walk into their space, you're surrounded by wood elements from all over the region that are on their way to being repurposed, from water towers and barns and fallen trees that have been shipped in. And so if you need a go-to person to make something out of reclaimed wood, Trilocks is one of the first places you want to look in New York. And so I just like to reflect from Lars, your comments, which I think were just really inspiring, of thinking about that global view of redistribution of resources that is almost an inevitable part of any sustainable worldview, is to think about how we do that effectively. And if wood can become one of those pieces at that scale, then, I mean, maybe it has to be. I'm not sure. And I don't think any of us are positive about that, but that certainly made a compelling case to think about to the more micro scale of entrepreneurs like Trilocks and Peter Pinchot in Ecuador, making businesses that actually allow for this to really happen. So moving from the very tactical to the conceptual and global to where can I buy this stuff is really, really critical. And I feel like our ethos of Wood at Work was so well represented today. I just want to thank everyone for jumping in and not being afraid to ask tough questions. I hope you felt like you were able to ask those questions, and it's just the start. Please reach out to folks that you may be wanting to talk to further. We'll share the whole email list. I believe I meant to ask everyone on the call if they would be okay with that. I'm pretty sure this group would be fine with sharing that information. And we're going to do this again, probably sooner than a year from now, but certainly in a year. Aaron.
Just wanted to end on a kind of maybe an interesting note to some of our participants here, that in about an hour and a half, I get to join the LA mayor, Eric Garcetti, who's leading C40 Cities right now. And they've just, C40 Cities, he's one of 4 mayors in Mexico City, Oslo, and a city in Europe, I can't recall right now, but they've signed a clean construction declaration where they're supposed to reduce by half their embodied carbon in buildings. That's across the city, not like city specific project, by 2030. So, I get to speak to him as part of the American Institute of Architects Legislative Action Day. But I've been speaking with a lot of LA head of Bureau of Engineering and others. They're all very interested in this, and they want to be focused on it. So I'm going to be suggesting to the LA mayor a task force. And some of what I've learned here will be instructive for that. And I look forward to speaking with him about what we were discussing as well. So, and LA is a signatory to Cities for Forests. So, but they haven't found a place to necessarily integrate some of these efforts. So anyway, I wanted to share that because you never know who's doing what and what, but in a few minutes I get to speak with the LA mayor. So
tell them they need to adopt the Sustainable Wood for Cities guide, man. We'll push it forward. We'll get into their hands. They can be one of the first early adopters. That's amazing.
That's cool.
That's great. Any other closing thoughts?
This was awesome, Scott.
Thank you all so much,
Scott, for all your effort as always.
It's just all about bringing this group together, and I'm never disappointed. I'm always inspired, and I hope you saw yourselves in what we shared with you today, because every word in that document, it's still just an early draft, but is coming from what we have heard and seen in the work that you guys are doing. So that was our intention, to faithfully represent that and continue having you involved in shaping it.
And thanks for Dan for sticking around till 9 p.m. or 8 p.m.
Yeah, it's late there, Dan.
I'm not sure what day it is.
You and Nikki are both on UK time.
Good connection. I need to go and put my head
Grace,
in,
yes, of course.
Yeah. Time for a wee dram, I guess, Dan. Or maybe not so
wee. My head in a bucket of ice, I think. So long on a Zoom call.
All right.
Go down to Cadenheads and buy yourself a bottle.
Thank you, everybody.
Okay. Good afternoon.
Thanks,
good night,
guys.
all. Yeah. Bye for now.
Thank you.